The village where time moves slowly. Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim your lights, find your favorite blanket, and maybe kick off your shoes. Tonight, we're going to step away from the loud, fast-paced chaos of the modern world and drift back into a place where the clocks didn't just move slowly. They practically stood still. We're headed to the forgotten corners of the old European countryside, specifically a few little hamlets where the local nobility was so committed to their own strange traditions and, well, their own DNA, that the rest of the world just sort of forgot they existed. It's going to be a long, quiet night of odd habits, questionable marriages, and people who were perhaps a bit too fond of their own cousins. So, just breathe, relax, and let's float over to our first stop. We begin in a village we'll call Oakavan, not because that was its name, but because the records are so dusty and the ink so faded that it's easier to just give it a cozy label. In Oakhaven, during the late 17th century, lived a local count named Friedrich. Now, Friedrich was a man of very simple tastes and a very complex family tree. When I say complex, I mean it looked less like a tree and more like a very confused tumbleweed. Friedrich was a man who believed that the outside world was a bit too experimental. He didn't like the new fashions. He didn't like the new music. And he especially didn't like the idea of marrying anyone who lived further than a brisk 3-minute walk from his front door. Because honestly, why travel for love when your second cousin is right there and already knows where you keep the good silverware? Friedrich was often described in local ledgers as the contented, which is usually historical code for nothing ever happened to this man and he didn't want it to. He spent his days watching the rain hit the windows of his manor, a manor that was, at this point, held together mostly by damp moss and stubbornness. He had a very specific routine. Every morning, he would wake up, complain about the quality of his porridge, and then spend 4 hours staring at a painting of his great-grandfather, who happened to be his great-uncle as well. Genetics are funny like that in Oakhaven. The village itself followed Friedrich's lead. It was a place where the most exciting event of the year was the ripening of a particularly large turnip. People would gather around the turnip, nod slowly, and then go back to their homes to nap for several hours. There was no sense of urgency. If a roof leaked, they'd put a bucket under it and wait for the next generation to deal with the actual repair. It was a lifestyle. Friedrich's wife, who was also his niece, because why not keep the titles in the family, was a woman named Elsbeth. Elsbeth was famous for her ability to sit perfectly still for 6 hours at a time. Some said she was deeply meditative. Others suspected she had simply mastered the art of sleeping with her eyes open to avoid talking to Friedrich. She was, as many royals of the time were, remarkably pale. Not a delicate porcelain pale, but more of a hasn't seen the sun since the mid-1600s kind of grayish blue. Together, they presided over a court that consisted of 3 elderly hounds, a gardener who had forgotten what plants were, and a chaplain who spent most of his time trying to remember his own name. It was the peak of aristocratic stagnation, and yet there was something almost hypnotic about it. No wars were fought here, mostly because nobody could be bothered to sharpen a sword. No scandals broke out, because a scandal requires effort, and effort was strictly against the local bylaws. Friedrich's main hobby was collecting clocks. You'd think a man obsessed with clocks would care about time, but Friedrich liked them specifically when they didn't work. He found the ticking sound aggressive. So, he had a room full of hundreds of silent golden clocks, all frozen at different moments of the day. It was his own private museum of never. One afternoon, a traveler actually stumbled into Oakhaven. This was a rare occurrence, usually reserved for people who were deeply lost, or perhaps running away from a very persistent debt collector. The traveler, a young man from the city, arrived with news of the Enlightenment. He talked about science, about the stars, about the rights of man. Friedrich listened to him for about 5 minutes, offered him a piece of very dry bread, and then asked if the young man knew how to fix a silent clock without making it tick. When the traveler said no, Friedrich lost interest and went back to his nap. That was the thing about these little pockets of history. The world would be reinventing itself. Nations were rising, Philosophies were shifting." End quote. And here was Friedrich, worrying about whether his favorite pair of velvet slippers was slightly more purple than it had been the week before. It's a certain kind of luxury, I suppose, to be so incredibly boring that history almost misses you entirely. But Friedrich wasn't the only one. If we drift further south, across some very sleepy hills and a river that barely moves, we find the estate of the Baroness von Heisler. The Baroness was a woman of significant means and even more significant boredom. Her family had been inbreeding with such dedication that by the time she was born, she had a jawline that could be used as a structural support beam, and a temperament that was roughly 10% human and 90%. The Baroness lived in a castle that was essentially a giant drafty hallway. She spent her days walking from one end of the hallway to the other. Why? Because the exercise helped her think, though she never quite specified what she was thinking about. Probably the weather, or the fact that her tea was always lukewarm. The Baroness was married to a man who was her first cousin, once removed on her mother's side, and her second cousin on her father's side. At that point, the family tree wasn't even a tumbleweed anymore. It was more like a single, very tired rope. Her husband, the Baron, was a man whose primary personality trait was being mildly startled. If a door closed too loudly, he would need a 3-day recovery period involving smelling salts and a dark room. They had 3 children, all of whom were described by the local doctor as remarkably soft. They didn't really play. They mostly just leaned against things. It was as if the energy of their ancestors had been entirely used up by the year 1500, leaving them with just enough vitality to blink and occasionally ask for a biscuit. The Baroness's favorite pastime was embroidery, but she never actually finished anything. She had hundreds of hoops with half-finished flowers and birds that lacked wings. She'd start a petal, sigh, and then decide that the world didn't really need another embroidered rose. And she was right, honestly. The world had plenty of roses. What it didn't have was her level of commitment to doing absolutely nothing. In their village, the peasants followed a similar rhythm. They grew the same crops their great-grandparents grew, in the same way, with the same mediocre results. There was a legend that once, back in the 14th century, a villager had tried to invent a new kind of plow. But he was quickly discouraged by his neighbors, who felt that the old plow was good enough for the dirt, so it's good enough for us. It's easy to look back and think of these places as tragic or stifling, but there's a quiet comfort in it, isn't there? No pressure to hustle, no 5-year plans, just a long, slow slide through time, punctuated by the occasional stale pastry and a very long sit in a comfortable chair. As the sun sets over the Baroness's drafty hallway and Friedrich's silent clocks, we see a pattern emerging. These weren't just people. They were the human equivalent of a low-power mode. They were the background noise of the centuries. And as we move forward into the lives of more active royals, we'll see that maybe, just maybe, being this boring was actually a survival strategy. Because the moment these families started trying to do things, well, that's when everything usually went up in flames. But for now, let's just stay here in the quiet. Let's imagine the smell of old wood, the sound of a very slow breeze, and the sight of a baron who is currently being startled by his own shadow. It's okay. Everything is moving slowly. There's nowhere else you need to be. Let's float over to another royal disaster, shall we? This one involves a crown, a very large wig, and a man who thought he was made of glass, the Glass King, and the fragility of royal egos. Welcome back. I hope you're feeling a bit heavier in your chair. Maybe your eyes are starting to get that pleasant, tired sting. We're leaving the quiet, mossy corners of Oakhaven now, and drifting toward a much grander, but significantly more fragile, setting, the French court of the late 14th century. Now, when you think of a king, you usually think of someone sitting on a throne made of gold or iron, commanding armies with a booming voice. But King Charles VI of France, affectionately, and then later quite literally known as Charles the Mad, was a bit different. He didn't think he was made of iron. He didn't even think he was made of particularly sturdy wood. No, Charles spent a good portion of his life convinced that he was made entirely of glass. And honestly, in the high-stress world of 14th century politics, who hasn't felt a little bit breakable? Charles started out well enough. He was called Charles the Beloved early on because he was young, handsome, and hadn't yet tried to hide in a cupboard for 3 days. But genetics, as we've discussed, have a funny way of catching up with you, especially when your family tree looks more like a recursive loop. The Valois line was, well, they were vibrant, which is history speak for deeply unstable. One day, while riding through a forest on a particularly hot afternoon, something in Charles's brain just sort of clicked, or perhaps it shattered. He suddenly decided that his knights were enemies, and after a brief and very awkward skirmish with his own shadow, the beloved version of Charles was retired. In its place came a man who was terrified that if anyone touched him, he would turn into a pile of expensive shards. To protect his glass body, Charles had special clothes made. He wore heavy, reinforced tunics with iron ribs sewn into them. Imagine, if you will, a king walking around looking like a very depressed, velvet-covered birdcage. He moved with a slow, deliberate caution, terrified of corners, doorways, and especially hugs. Of course, the court had to play along, because you don't tell a man with an army that he's actually made of skin and bone. You just walk very, very softly when you're near him, because why not add more stress to a fragile situation? The court life around him continued in its usual, snarky, high-fashion way. While Charles was busy worrying about shattering, his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, was busy holding some of the most elaborate and, frankly, ridiculous parties in history. Isabeau was a woman who lived for the extra. She once wore a headdress so tall that doors had to be physically heightened so she could walk through them without decapitating her fashion sense. She was the polar opposite of her husband's quiet, crystalline anxiety. She was loud, she was expensive, and she was very fond of her brother-in-law, the Duke of Orleans. Because, again, why look outside the family for drama when you can find it right across the dinner table? The court of Charles VI was a slow-motion train wreck. Everyone was trying to steal power, while the king was busy wrapping himself in blankets. There was a pervasive sense of "this is fine," while the kingdom literally fell apart during the 100 Years' War. But in the halls of the palace, the biggest concern wasn't the English army. It was making sure no one accidentally bumped into the king during a particularly energetic dance. Charles had periods of lucidity, but they were brief and usually involved him forgetting who his wife was. He would look at Isabeau and politely ask who that strange woman with the giant hat was. To be fair, given Isabeau's hats, it was a valid question. Let's float over to the servants for a moment. Imagine being the royal valet for a man made of glass. Your entire career depends on your ability to put a pair of pants on a king without causing a psychological fracture. It was the ultimate high-stakes egg and spoon race, but the egg was the monarch of France, and the spoon was a damp castle in the middle of a war. The tragedy of Charles wasn't just his mind. It was the sheer, boring repetition of it. He lived like this for decades. Decades of sitting in a darkened room, refusing to bathe because water might smudge his glass surface, and staring at the walls. It's a very specific kind of royal dysfunction, not the chopping off heads kind, but the slowly fading into the wallpaper kind. And while Charles was being fragile, the rest of the royals were being, well, themselves. His son, the future Charles VII, grew up in this atmosphere of quiet terror and loud hats. He was a sickly, nervous boy who probably wondered if he, too, was a window pane waiting to happen. The sheer weight of the Valois legacy was enough to make anyone want to hide under a bed. The Glass King eventually passed away, leaving behind a kingdom that was as broken as he feared he was. But his story serves as a gentle reminder of the weird pressures of being chosen by God to rule. If God chose you, and you feel like you're breaking, maybe it's not you. Maybe it's the crown. But don't worry about crowns tonight. You aren't made of glass. You're tucked in, safe and warm, far away from 14th century France and its questionable headdresses. Let's drift away from the Valois and their crystalline worries. Let's move toward a different kind of royal disaster. We're going to head over to Spain, where the Hapsburg jaw was about to reach its final, magnificent, and highly impractical form. The peak of the Hapsburg tumbleweed were drifting now, away from the fragile glass halls of France and moving south, across the Pyrenees, into the sun-drenched but strangely somber court of 17th century Spain. If you're feeling a bit heavy-limbed and your thoughts are starting to blur like watercolors in the rain, that's perfect. We're entering the era of the Hapsburgs, a family that took the concept of keeping it in the family and turned it into a high-stakes, multi-generational science experiment that no one actually asked for. Enter Charles II of Spain, or as his contemporaries called him, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Because obviously if a king can't chew his own food and has a tongue so large he can barely speak, it must be dark magic, right? It couldn't possibly be the fact that his family tree had fewer branches than a telephone pole. Charles was the grand finale of the Spanish Hapsburgs. He was the biological equivalent of a system error message. His ancestors had spent centuries marrying their nieces, their cousins, and probably anyone else who shared the same chin, all to keep their land and titles from leaking out to strangers. And the result was Charles Yaman, who looked, as some whispered, like a half-baked potato that had been left in the sun for too long. He had the famous Hapsburg jaw, of course, but while his father's jaw was a statement, Charles's jaw was a whole paragraph. It was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth didn't actually meet. Eating was less of a regal banquet and more of a complex mechanical challenge. He was also remarkably pale, with skin the color of old parchment, and he didn't learn to walk until he was almost 6 years old. But hey, when you're the king of half the world, why walk when people can just carry you from one velvet cushion to the next? The Spanish court during this time was a masterpiece of boredom and etiquette. Everything was slow. Everything was rigid. There was a rule for how many steps you could take toward the king, how you had to bow, and exactly which specific duke was allowed to hand him his napkin. It was a world of black velvet, stiff lace collars, and a silence so thick you could almost taste it. Charles spent most of his days being managed. He wasn't exactly ruling. He was more like a very expensive, very frail mascot for an empire that was slowly running out of steam. He liked to play with wooden soldiers and look at the fish in the palace ponds. There's something almost sweet about it, if you ignore the fact that he was technically responsible for millions of people and a global superpower. He was a child who never really grew up, trapped in a body that was essentially a collection of genetic oops moments. Of course, because he was a king, he had to get married. Twice. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was young, vibrant, and French, which in the Spanish court was basically like being an alien from a planet where people actually enjoyed themselves. She arrived in Madrid to find a husband who was, well, Charles. The poor girl was miserable. She missed the parties of Versailles, the music, and the ability to have a conversation that didn't involve a 3-hour protocol check. Charles, to his credit, adored her in his own quiet, confused way. He would follow her around the palace like a sad royal puppy. But the marriage was, predictably, childless. Because when your DNA is basically a photocopy of a photocopy, the machine eventually stops working. After Marie-Louise passed away, likely from the sheer exhaustion of being that bored, Charles was married off again to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Maria Anna was a different story. She was a powerhouse. She realized very quickly that Charles wasn't going to be making any major decisions, so she decided she would make them for him. She spent her days arguing with the king's mother, Mariana of Austria, who, for the record, was also Charles's niece and his mother at the same time. Don't try to map it out in your head, it'll only wake you up. The two women fought over everything, which ministers to hire, which portraits to hang, and probably which type of religious relic should be placed under Charles's pillow to help him produce an heir. Meanwhile, Charles just sat there, perhaps wondering if anyone was going to bring him another biscuit. As the years went by, Charles's health, which was never great to begin with, started to truly fade. He became obsessed with his own death, which is a very Hapsburg thing to do. He even went down into the royal tombs at the Escorial and asked the monks to open the coffins of his ancestors so he could look at them. Just a casual afternoon activity, hanging out with the dusty remains of your great-grandfather uncle. But even in his decline, the world around him remained oddly still. The Spanish Empire was like a giant, ornate clock that had been wound too tight and was now just stopping. The gold from the New World was drying up, the wars were losing their luster, and the king was spending his final days being exorcised by priests who were convinced his inability to digest breakfast was the work of the devil. When Charles finally passed away in 1700, he was only 38, but he had the body of an 80-year-old. The autopsy report, which is a real, very weird historical document, claimed he didn't have a single drop of blood in him. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his head was full of water. Now that's probably a bit of medical hyperbole from the time, but it paints a picture, doesn't it? A man who was physically used up by the weight of his own heritage. With his death, the Spanish Hapsburg line ended. Not with a bang, but with a very long, very tired sigh. The throne passed to the Bourbons, and a whole new set of disasters began. But for a moment, Spain was just quiet. So, let's leave Charles there, resting in the cool dark stone of the Escorial, finally free from the jaw, the etiquette, and the meddling relatives. He doesn't have to be a king anymore. He can just be still. And you can be still, too. The world is very quiet right now. The stars are out over the Spanish plains, and the only sound is the faint rustle of history's pages turning. Let's float away from the heavy velvet of Madrid. We're going to head north again, to the snowy, glittering, and deeply strange courts of Russia, where a very tall man was about to decide that everyone needed to shave their beards and start acting like Europeans, whether they wanted to or not. The giant who hated beards, we're leaving the heavy, sun-baked silence of Spain now. Imagine the air getting crisper, turning from a warm Mediterranean breeze into a sharp, biting wind that smells of pine needles and wood. We're drifting across the vast, flat plains of Eastern Europe, landing softly in the snowy, muddy, and chaotic world of 17th century Russia. And there, standing head and shoulders above everyone else, literally, he was nearly 7 feet tall, is Peter the Great. Now, great is a heavy word. It implies a lot of dignity in marble statues. But Peter was less of a marble statue and more of a human hurricane with a very short attention span and a very large collection of dental tools. He was a man who decided all by himself that Russia was simply too old-fashioned. He looked at the long robes, the flowing beards, and the ancient traditions of his boyars, and he basically said, "No, we're going to be Dutch now. Or maybe English. Definitely something with more ships." Peter was a Romanov, and while the Romanovs weren't quite as genetically tangled as the Hapsburgs yet, give them time. They'll get there. They had their own brand of vibrant energy. Peter's childhood was spent hiding from palace guards who were busy murdering his family members, which is usually a recipe for a very relaxed and stable adulthood. Of course it was. As a result, Peter developed a nervous tic. His face would occasionally twitch, and his hands were always moving. He couldn't sit still. If he wasn't building a boat, he was pulling someone's tooth, and if he wasn't pulling a tooth, he was traveling across Europe in a very thin disguise that fooled absolutely no one. Imagine a 7-foot-tall man with a tiny mustache, dressed in a carpenter's outfit, trying to blend in at a Dutch shipyard. He called himself Peter Mikhailov, but everyone knew it was the Tsar. They just played along because, well, he was 7 feet tall and had a very large sword. He spent his time learning how to build ships, how to navigate by the stars, and how to drink everyone under the table. It was the ultimate gap year, but with more geopolitics. When Peter returned to Russia, he decided that the new Russia started with the face. He famously began cutting off the beards of his nobles with a pair of oversized scissors. In old Russia, a beard was a sign of religious devotion and manhood. To Peter, it was just a place for soup to get stuck. He even instituted a beard tax. If you wanted to keep your facial hair, you had to pay a fee and carry around a little bronze coin that basically said, "I paid for this beard." Because why not turn personal grooming into a revenue stream? But the weirdest part of Peter's court wasn't the lack of beards. It was his all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. This was an official group Peter created that was dedicated to, well, mocking the church and getting incredibly drunk. They had their own pope and their own rituals, which mostly involved drinking vodka out of massive bowls until everyone fell over. It was a very loud, very rowdy way to run a country. And yet, Peter was also a man of science. He was obsessed with anatomy. He had a chamber of curiosities filled with things in jars, two-headed calves, strange plants, and hundreds of teeth he had personally pulled from his courtiers. If you had a toothache in Peter's court, you stayed very, very quiet. If the Tsar heard about it, he'd show up with his bag of rusty pliers and a look of scientific curiosity. And you couldn't exactly say no to the Tsar, even if he wasn't a licensed dentist. Of course not. Peter's personal life was just as, well, energetic. He had his first wife, Eudoxia, sent to a convent because she was too traditional, and she didn't like his boat-building hobby. His second wife, Catherine, was a former peasant woman who managed to be the only person who could calm him down when his fits started. She would hold his head in her lap and stroke his hair until the giant fell asleep. It's a strangely tender image, this massive, terrifying man who just spent the morning yelling at the Baltic Sea, finally finding a moment of peace. But peace was rare for Peter. He decided to build a city in a swamp, St. Petersburg, mostly out of spite and a desire to have a window to the west. Thousands of people died building it, and it was constantly flooding, but Peter didn't care. He wanted a European city, and by God, he was going to have one, even if everyone had to wear itchy wool coats and learn how to dance the minuet while their boots were full of mud. Peter's son, Alexei, was the opposite of his father. Alexei liked books, he liked religion, he didn't like boats at all. Peter looked at his son and saw a weakling who would undo all his hard work. The conflict ended, predictably and tragically, with Alexei being tortured to death on his father's orders. Because in the world of the Romanovs, family therapy was usually just a very deep dungeon. Despite the chaos and the occasional execution, Peter's Russia was a place of transformation. He dragged a medieval kingdom into the modern age by its beard. He was a man of infinite, exhausting movement. He never walked, he sprinted. He never rested, he brooded. But even a giant has to stop eventually. Peter died at 52, supposedly after jumping into icy water to save some drowning sailors. It was a fittingly dramatic end for a man who spent his life obsessed with water and ships. And now, Petersburg is quiet. The winter snow is falling over the Neva River, covering the palaces and the statues in a soft white blanket. The all-drunken synod has finally gone to sleep. The teeth in the jars are still. The beards are long gone. Take a deep breath. Feel the cold, clean air of the Russian night. You aren't building a city in a swamp. You aren't being chased by a czar with a pair of pliers. You're just here, in the stillness. Let's float away from the snowy spires of Russia. We're heading back towards Central Europe, to a place where the royalty was less concerned with boats and more concerned with, well, being incredibly spoiled and slightly magical. We're going to the court of Bavaria, where a fairy tale king was about to spend all of his money on castles that looked like they belonged on the back of a chocolate box. The king of the chocolate box castles, we're leaving the snowy, teeth-pulling chaos of St. Petersburg now. Feel the air soften as we drift south and west, back into the heart of Europe. We're settling into the lush, rolling hills of Bavaria, a place of deep green forests, jagged blue mountains, and a man who really, truly did not want to be a king. Enter Ludwig II of Bavaria. You might know him as the fairy tale king, or perhaps Mad King Ludwig, though the king of expensive interior decorating might be more accurate. Ludwig was a Wittelsbach, a family that had ruled Bavaria for roughly forever. By the time Ludwig came along in the mid-19th century, the Wittelsbachs had developed a very specific, very refined kind of eccentricity. They weren't inbred to the point of structural failure like the Hapsburgs, but they were definitely creative. Ludwig's grandfather had a gallery of beauties, just a room full of portraits of women he thought were attractive. His father was obsessed with walking uphill. And Ludwig? Ludwig was obsessed with the moon, the composer Richard Wagner, and spending money he didn't actually have. Ludwig became king at 18. He was tall, striking, and had a head full of romantic poems and medieval legends. He looked like the hero of a Gothic novel, but unfortunately, he had the job of a constitutional monarch. He was supposed to sign papers, attend boring meetings about taxes, and talk to politicians who smelled like tobacco and boredom. Naturally, Ludwig hated it. So, he did what any of us would do if we had a national treasury and a very active imagination. He opted out. Ludwig stopped living in the daytime. He became a creature of the night, waking up at sunset and going to bed at dawn. He traveled through the mountains in a golden rococo sleigh, even in the middle of summer, dressed like a medieval knight. Because why not? If you're a king and you want to be a knight in a sleigh in July, who's going to stop you? The Parliament? Well, eventually yes, but we'll get there. Ludwig's true passion was his castles. He didn't want to live in the old drafty palaces of Munich with their history and their responsibilities. He wanted to live in a fantasy. So he built Neuschwanstein, the castle that inspired Disney. It sits on a cliff, looking like a dream made of white limestone. But here's the thing, it wasn't a fortress. It was a stage set. It had a Venus grotto, an artificial cave with an underground lake, colored lights, and a mechanical swan-shaped boat where Ludwig could sit and listen to Wagner's operas in private. Imagine being the guy who had to change the light bulbs in the royal grotto. "What are you doing today, Hans?" "Oh, just making sure the king's mechanical swan doesn't sink while he's pretending to be a medieval hero." Again. Ludwig was remarkably lonely. He never married, mostly because he found the idea of a queen a bit too real-world. He preferred the company of his horses, his servants, whom he sometimes made dress up like characters from his favorite legends, and the ghosts of dead French kings. He was particularly obsessed with Louis XIV, the Sun King, and even built a replica of Versailles on a lake in Bavaria. Because one Versailles just wasn't enough for his aesthetic. As the years went by, Ludwig stopped talking to people altogether. He would communicate with his ministers through notes, and if he had to have a formal dinner, he would have a table that rose through the floor, already set with food, so he didn't have to see the servants. It was the 19th century version of contactless delivery. Of course, the Bavarian government wasn't thrilled about the king spending the national budget on grottos and golden sleighs. They eventually decided that Ludwig was mad. Was he? Or was he just a guy who really liked his privacy and hated boring meetings? The end of Ludwig's story is as mysterious as his castles. He was deposed, taken to a lakeside manor, and found dead in the water the next day along with his doctor. To this day, nobody really knows what happened. Some say he tried to escape, others say he just wanted to be part of the water, much like the characters in the operas he loved so much. But even after he was gone, his castles remained. The folly that nearly bankrupted Bavaria is now the thing that keeps the state's tourism alive. There's a certain irony in that the king who hated the public is now the reason millions of people visit his private bedroom every year. So, let's leave Ludwig in his mountain dream. The moon is high over the Alps, the mechanical swan is still, and the candles in the golden sleigh have finally flickered out. The world is quiet. The mountains are dark. Take a deep breath. Feel the weight of the blankets. You aren't responsible for a national budget. You aren't being deposed by a grumpy parliament. You're just here, drifting. Let's float away from the Bavarian peaks. We're heading across the channel now, to a damp, foggy island, where a queen is about to go into a very, very long mourning period. The queen of the eternal shadow, we're drifting now, leaving the glittering, swan-shaped dreams of Bavaria behind. Feel the air thicken with a familiar, cool dampness. We're crossing the English Channel, gliding through a heavy charcoal gray fog that smells of coal smoke, damp wool, and very, very old tea. We've arrived in Victorian England, a place that took the concept of seriousness and turned it into a national competitive sport. And there, sitting in a room filled with heavy mahogany furniture and too many doilies, is Queen Victoria. Now, Victoria wasn't always the stern, unblinking woman in the black veil you see on the postage stamps. In her youth, she was quite vibrant, which, as we know by now, is code for stubborn and prone to screaming matches with her mother. She loved dancing, she loved opera, and she especially loved a German prince named Albert, who happened to be her first cousin. Because, once again, why look for a husband in a different gene pool when you can just marry the guy you played with in the nursery? Albert was the ultimate straight man to Victoria's drama. He was organized, he was intellectual, and he was obsessed with efficiency. He basically spent their marriage trying to turn the British monarchy into a well-run middle management firm. He organized the Great Exhibition, he redesigned the royal palaces, and he even managed the nursery with the precision of a clockmaker. They had 9 children. 9. Imagine the noise. Imagine the sheer volume of lace. But in the midst of all that domestic chaos, Victoria and Albert created a world that was perfectly, suffocatingly orderly. Everything had its place. Every hour was accounted for. It was the peak of respectability. But then, in 1861, Albert did the one thing he hadn't scheduled. He died. He was only 42, and that's when the great stillness began. Victoria didn't just mourn Albert, she turned mourning into a full-time career. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She retreated to her estates at Osborne and Balmoral, becoming a sort of royal ghost that haunted her own palaces. She became the widow of Windsor, a woman so dedicated to the past that she made sure Albert's room was kept exactly as it was the day he died. Every single morning, for 4 decades, servants would bring hot water for Albert's shaving mug. They would lay out his clothes on the bed. They would change the linens. They were essentially ghostwriting a life that had ended 40 years prior. It's a very specific kind of royal devotion, one that borders on a very slow, very polite horror movie. The atmosphere of the court became, well, heavy. If you were an aristocrat during this time, your life was governed by a set of rules so complex they make modern tax codes look like a comic book. There was a specific way to hold your gloves, a specific duration for half mourning, where you were allowed to wear lavender or gray if you were feeling particularly wild, and a very specific way to walk so that your silk skirts didn't make too much noise. Victoria's children grew up in this shadow. Her eldest son, Berthier, the future Edward II, was the polar opposite of his mother. He liked cigars, he liked gambling, and he liked people who weren't dead. Victoria looked at him and saw a frivolous boy who would surely ruin everything Albert had built. She essentially spent the rest of her life being disappointed in him in a very quiet, very black-clad way. The Queen became obsessed with the occult, as many people did in the late 19th century. She was particularly fond of a Scottish servant named John Brown, who was one of the few people allowed to speak to her like a normal human being. He called her woman, which in the context of 19th century etiquette was practically a revolutionary act. Rumors swirled, of course, because humans cannot resist a bit of gossip, especially when it involves a queen and a man in a kilt. But mostly, Victoria just sat. She sat and wrote in her journals millions of words about her feelings, her family, and her indigestion. She presided over an empire that covered a quarter of the globe, yet her own world was often limited to the distance between her writing desk and her tea tray. There is something hypnotic about the Victorian era. The ticking of grandfather clocks in long carpeted hallways, the smell of lavender and old paper, the feeling that everything is being preserved in a glass jar, away from the messy, fast-moving world outside. It was an age of hush. As the 20th century approached, the world began to speed up. Electricity was appearing, cars were being built, and the rigid structures of the old world were starting to crack. But Victoria stayed exactly where she was. She was the anchor. She was the person who ensured that, no matter how much the world changed, there would always be a woman in a black veil, drinking tea and feeling slightly annoyed by the modern age. When she finally passed away in 1901, an entire century seemed to exhale. The mourning was over. The shaving water was no longer brought to Albert's room. The black veils were lifted. So, let's leave Victoria in the quiet, dim light of Windsor. The tea is cold, the journal is closed, and the ghost of Albert is finally allowed to rest. The world is moving on, but you don't have to. You can stay right here in the fog. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the stillness of the room. You aren't mourning a prince. You aren't managing an empire. You're just a passenger on a very slow, very quiet boat drifting through time. Let's float away from the damp, gray islands of Britain. We are heading east again, toward a place where the mountains are high and the royal families are. Well, they're about to have a very, very bad afternoon. We're going to the court of Austria-Hungary, where the Hapsburgs are having one last, tragic, and incredibly complicated family meeting. The star-crossed empress and the hunting lodge we're drifting now, leaving the damp, soot-stained fog of Victorian London. Feel the air get thinner and sharper as we glide across the heart of Europe once more, rising up over the jagged snow-capped peaks of the Austrian Alps. We're settling into the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, a place of white marble, red velvet, and enough gold leaf to make your eyes feel heavy just looking at it. And there, standing in front of a mirror for 3 hours while a servant braids her floor-length hair with real diamonds, is Empress Elizabeth of Austria, and better known to the world, and to history's gossips as Sisi. If Queen Victoria was the patron saint of mourning, Sisi was the patron saint of I'd really rather be anywhere else. She was a Wittelsbach Ludwig of Bavaria's cousin. In fact, so she had that same creative streak, which in the rigid, suffocating court of the Hapsburgs was about as welcome as a loud sneeze in a library. Sisi married Emperor Franz Joseph when she was only 16. Franz Joseph was a man who lived for paperwork. He woke up at 4:00 a.m. every day to sit at a desk and sign things. He was the human equivalent of a very dutiful filing cabinet. He loved Sisi in his own stiff, bureaucratic way. But Sisi loved being free. And the Vienna court was the opposite of free. The court was run by her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who viewed Sisi as a sort of decorative but slightly defective breeding mare. Sisi wasn't allowed to raise her own children. She wasn't allowed to eat what she wanted. She wasn't even allowed to go for a walk without a dozen ladies-in-waiting trailing behind her like a gaggle of judgmental geese. So, Sisi did the only thing a Wittelsbach could do. She became obsessed with her own appearance. She exercised for hours on end. She even had gymnastic rings installed in her dressing room. Imagine a 19th century empress in a silk gown, doing pull-ups while her servants held her jewelry. She went on starvation diets involving nothing but thin meat broth and oranges. She was the most beautiful woman in Europe, and she was absolutely, profoundly miserable. She spent most of her life traveling, trying to outrun her own shadow. She went to Corfu, to England, to Hungary, anywhere that wasn't Vienna. She had an anchor tattooed on her shoulder, which was essentially the 1880s version of a rebellious teenage phase, except she was the empress of an empire. But while Sisi was running away, her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was stuck in the middle of it all. Rudolf was a vibrant Hapsburg intellectual, liberal, and deeply, deeply lonely. He didn't get along with his father, the filing cabinet, and he rarely saw his mother, the traveling gymnast. He felt like a man out of time, waiting for a throne that wouldn't come and an empire that was slowly rotting from the inside. This all leads us to a snowy January night in 1889 at a hunting lodge called Meierling. Now usually, a hunting lodge is a place for muddy boots and dead pheasants, but Meierling became the site of the ultimate Hapsburg tragedy. Rudolf was there with his mistress, a 17-year-old baroness named Mary Wetzera. The next morning, they were both found dead. The official story changed a dozen times. Was it a double suicide? Was it a political assassination? Was it a lover's quarrel gone wrong? The Hapsburgs, true to form, tried to scrub the whole thing under the rug. They claimed Rudolf had a mental collapse, which, considering his family tree, wasn't exactly a hard sell to the public. Sisi never recovered. She traded her diamonds for black veils, much like her contemporary, Victoria, and spent the rest of her life wandering Europe as a lonely queen. She eventually met her end at the hands of an anarchist in Geneva, who stabbed her with a sharpened file. She didn't even realize she'd been hurt at first. She just smoothed her dress, boarded a steamship, and fainted. It's a strange, quiet end for a woman who spent her life trying to escape the weight of a crown. She was finally free of the corsets, the hair braiding, and the endless, dusty etiquette of Vienna. The Habsburg Empire didn't last much longer after that. Without an heir like Rudolf, and with Franz Joseph still sitting at his desk signing papers well into his 80s, the whole thing was just waiting for a spark to set it off. And as we know, that spark eventually came in Sarajevo. But that's a much louder, much less sleepy story for another night. For now, let's just stay in the quiet halls of the Hofburg. The candles are burning low. The sound of Sisi's silk skirts has faded down the long, mirrored corridor. The filing cabinet has finally closed for the night. Take a breath. Feel the stillness of the mountain air. You aren't an empress. You aren't a crown prince. You're just here, drifting through the shadows of the old world. Let's float away from the ruins of the Habsburgs. We are heading north one last time, to the edge of the world, to the frozen, glittering palaces of the last Tsar, where a family is about to be enchanted by a very strange, very hairy man from the wilderness. The monk, the mystery, and the falling snow were drifting now, leaving the marble echoes of Vienna behind. Feel the air turn brittle and cold, the kind of cold that makes the wooden beams of a house groan in the night. We're traveling back to Russia, but not the bustling, shipbuilding Russia of Peter the Great. This is the twilight of the Romanovs, a world of velvet curtains, flickering icons, and a family that was desperately trying to pretend the 20th century wasn't happening right outside their front door. And there, standing in the middle of a gilded drawing room, smelling of unwashed wool and cheap wine, is Grigory Rasputin. Now, if you were a Russian aristocrat in 1905, your life was a very specific blend of French champagne and deep existential dread. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was a man who would have been a perfectly lovely country squire. He loved his wife, he loved his garden, and he loved taking long, quiet walks. Unfortunately, he was also the autocrat of all the Russias, a job that required a bit more than a nice temperament and a well-trimmed beard. His wife, Alexandria, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, because of course she was a woman of high anxiety and deep devotion. She brought with her the Victorian sense of duty and the Habsburg sense of impending doom. And, most tragically, she brought the Habsburg, or rather Hessian gene for hemophilia. Their only son, Alexei, the heir to the Romanov throne, was a bleeder. In an era before modern medicine, a bumped knee or a bruised elbow wasn't just a childhood injury. It was a potential death sentence. The family lived in a state of permanent, quiet terror, watching the boy's every step like he was made of, well, glass. Enter Rasputin. He was a starets, a holy man from the deep, muddy heart of Siberia. He had long, greasy hair, a beard that looked like it housed several species of local birds, and eyes that people described as burning. He claimed he could heal the boy, and, inexplicably, whenever he was around, Alexei's bleeding stopped. Was it hypnosis? Was it the fact that he told the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which, ironically, thins the blood? Or was it just the sheer, overwhelming confidence of a man who didn't care about royal protocol? To Alexandra, it didn't matter. He was a miracle. To the rest of Russia, he was a disaster. Imagine the scene at the Winter Palace. You have the Tsar, trying to ignore the revolution brewing in the streets, the Tsarina, praying in front of a wall of icons, and in the corner, a Siberian peasant is eating soup with his hands and giving advice on how to run the army. It was surreal. It was vibrant. It was deeply, deeply weird. Rasputin became the most powerful man in Russia, simply because he was the only one who could calm the Empress. He'd send her little notes in scratchy, barely legible handwriting, telling her that the little one would be fine as long as the friend was nearby. And while he was saving the air, he was also busy spending his nights at the most questionable taverns in St. Petersburg, drinking until dawn and telling everyone exactly how much influence he had over the Tsar. The Russian nobility, who were already bored and irritable, decided they'd had enough. They didn't mind a bit of mysticism, but they drew the line at a peasant choosing the prime minister. So a group of conspirators, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, a man so wealthy he reportedly owned a diamond-encrusted dog collar, decided Rasputin had to go. The story of Rasputin's final night is the stuff of legend, mostly because Yusupov wrote a book about it later, and he wasn't exactly known for his modesty. According to the story, they fed Rasputin cakes laced with enough cyanide to kill a small elephant. Rasputin ate them all and asked for more. Then they gave him poisoned wine. He drank it and started singing. Eventually, they just shot him. And then they shot him again. And then, just to be sure, they threw him into the frozen Neva River. When his body was found, the legend says there was water in his lungs, meaning the poison and the bullets hadn't finished the job. The river had. It was a dark, messy end to a dark, messy chapter. But Rasputin had left the Romanovs with a parting gift, a prophecy. He told them that if he was killed by commoners, the monarchy would survive. But if he was killed by the Tsar's own relatives, the entire family would be gone within 2 years. He was right. 2 years later, the snow in St. Petersburg was stained with something other than coal dust. The revolution had arrived. The Romanovs were moved from palace to palace, each one smaller and more drafty than the last, until they ended up in a basement in Siberia. There was no more champagne. There were no more diamond-braided hair sessions. There was just the cold, the silence, and the end of an era. The Romanovs, like the Hapsburgs and the Bourbons before them, faded into the static of history. They became characters in a story we tell ourselves to fall asleep, a story about people who had everything, and yet, in the end, had nothing but each other. So, let's leave the Romanovs there, in the quiet, frozen heart of Russia. The wind is howling across the steppes, the bells of the Kremlin are silent, and the friend is finally at peace beneath the ice. Take a deep, slow breath. Feel the warmth of your own room. You aren't in a Siberian basement. You aren't waiting for a miracle. You're just here, drifting on the edge of sleep. The history of the world is a long, winding river, full of people who thought they were the center of the universe, only to find themselves becoming the footnotes of tomorrow. It's okay to be a footnote. It's okay to be quiet. It's okay to let the clocks stop ticking. I'll stay here for a while, watching the snow fall over the ruins of the old world. When you're ready, we can move on to the next chapter, or we can just stay here in the dark, where it's safe and still. The last king of the sun-drenched isles were drifting again. Can you feel the heavy, frozen air of Russia beginning to melt away? We are lifting off from the snowy basement of history and floating south, far south, across the continents until the air becomes thick, sweet, and heavy, with the scent of hibiscus and sea salt. We are arriving in the kingdom of Hawaii in the late 19th century, a place of turquoise water, black volcanic rock, and a monarchy that was trying to bridge the gap between ancient gods and modern steamships. And there, sitting in a palace made of coral and fine koa wood, lit by the very first electric light bulbs in the Pacific, is King Kalakaua, the merry monarch. Now, if Peter the Great was a hurricane and Ludwig was a dream, Kalakaua was a celebration. He was a man of immense charm, a world traveler, and a lover of a good party. But he was also a man who knew, deep in his bones, that his world was shrinking. The big powers, the sugar barons, the missionaries, and the businessmen from the mainland were circling his islands like sharks in the reef. So, what does a king do when he knows his kingdom is being swallowed by the modern world? Well, if you're Kalakaua, you double down on the beauty of the past. Kalakaua spent his reign reviving the hula, which had been banned by the more buttoned-up missionaries who thought dancing was a bit too much fun for a Sunday. He brought back the old chants, the old genealogies, and the old feather capes. He built Tiolani Palace, a magnificent building that had telephones and electricity before the White House did. Because if you're going to be the last of a line, you might as well have the best lighting in the hemisphere. He was a vibrant king in the best sense. He traveled around the world, meeting Queen Victoria, who probably thought he was a bit too cheerful, and the Emperor of Japan. He was looking for allies, for a way to keep his islands independent. But back home, the sugar barons were growing restless. They didn't want a merry monarch who spent money on coronations and world tours. They wanted land, and they wanted power. The court of Kalakaua was a strange, beautiful blend. You'd have a formal Victorian ball with ladies in corsets and men in heavy wool suits, but the windows would be wide open to the tropical night, and the music would be a mix of European waltzes and Hawaiian steel guitars. It was a world that was trying to be two things at once, caught in the middle of a shifting tide. Kalakaua's sister, Liliuokalani, was the one who eventually had to carry the heaviest burden. She was a composer, a woman of deep dignity, and she wrote Aloha E'o'o, a song that everyone knows as a goodbye, but was actually a love song to a disappearing world. When Kalakaua passed away in a hotel in San Francisco, his final words recorded on a wax cylinder were, "Tell my people I tried," and he did try. But the bayonet constitution and the businessmen had already made their move. Liliuokalani was eventually overthrown and placed under house arrest in her own palace. She spent her days quilting, a very Victorian hobby, incorporating the story of her kingdom into the stitches. Imagine the queen of a paradise, sitting in a room, sewing her heart into a blanket, while the world outside became a territory, then a state, then a tourist destination. It's a different kind of royal tragedy. No guillotines, no frozen rivers, just a quiet, slow fading out. A kingdom that was annexed by a signature on a piece of paper. So, let's leave the islands now. The sun is setting over Diamond Head, turning the Pacific into a sheet of hammered gold. The sound of the surf is the only clock that matters here. The hula dancers have gone home. The electric lights in the palace have been dimmed, and the scent of the flowers is getting stronger in the cool night air. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the warmth of the sand in your mind. You aren't fighting for a kingdom. You aren't sewing a quilt of lost dreams. You're just here, in the gentle rhythm of the waves. The world is very big, and very old, and very, very tired. And it's okay for you to be tired too. All the kings and queens we've talked about tonight, the ones made of glass, the ones with the big jaws, the ones who love their cousins a bit too much, they're all at rest now. Their stories are just ripples on the water. The water is still, the night is long, and you are safe. The Hermit King and the Garden of Static we've traveled a long way tonight, haven't we? From the silent, broken clocks of Oak Haven to the golden sinking sun of the Hawaiian Islands. Your limbs probably feel like they're made of warm lead by now, and the world outside your window is likely just a collection of soft, indistinct shadows. We're going to take one last stop, not at a palace, and not in the middle of a revolution. We're going to a small, quiet villa in the Italian countryside, where a man who was once the king of Spain decided that being a king was, quite frankly, far too much work. This is the story of Charles IV of Spain, the father of the man who liked to look at his ancestors' coffins. But Charles IV was different. He didn't have the glass anxiety of the French or the shipbuilding mania of the Russians. Charles IV had the soul of a professional napper. He lived during the time of Napoleon, which was a very bad time to be a relaxed, somewhat dim-witted monarch. While Napoleon was busy redrawing the map of Europe with a sword, Charles was busy with his two true passions, hunting and clocks. He reportedly had over 1,000 clocks in his palace, and he spent his mornings making sure they all chimed at exactly the same time. It was the only thing in his kingdom he could actually control. Eventually, Napoleon, who had very little patience for people who liked clocks more than cannons, tricked Charles into giving up his throne. Most kings would have fought, or at least written a very angry letter. Charles? Charles basically sighed with relief. He took his pension, his wife, his favorite paintings, and his best hunting dogs, and he moved to Italy. He spent the rest of his life as a royal hermit. He lived in a villa surrounded by overgrown gardens where the statues were covered in ivy and the fountains only gurgled on Tuesdays. He didn't miss the crown. He didn't miss the etiquette. He didn't even miss Spain. He just wanted to wake up, eat a very long lunch, and then tinker with a pocket watch until it was time for tea. There's a painting of him by Goya, a famous one. In it, the royal family looks, well, vibrant isn't the word. They look like a group of people who won the lottery and are now deeply confused about how to hold their own hands. Charles stands in the middle, looking like a friendly, bewildered baker who accidentally put on a sash made of diamonds. He looks happy. He looks like a man who knows that in the grand scheme of things, a well-oiled gear in a clock is much more reliable than a political alliance. And so, Charles lived out his days in a world of static. No more wars, no more Hapsburg jaws, no more chosen by God nonsense. Just the ticking of 1,000 clocks in a quiet Italian afternoon. He became a footnote, and he loved every second of it. That's where we'll leave our history tonight. Not with a crown, but with a quiet room and a man who finally found a way to stop time, even if it was just for himself. The history of the world is full of loud people doing loud things. But for every Napoleon, there's a Charles III, sitting in a garden, watching the shadows grow long. For every Peter the Great, there's a Sisi, looking for a way to be invisible. We focus on the drama, but the sleepy parts of history, the long afternoons, the silent halls, the slow-moving villages, that's where most of life actually happens. The air in your room is still now. The light is soft. The kings and queens have all tucked themselves into the dusty pages of the past, and they've left the world to you. You don't have to build a castle. You don't have to cut off anyone's beard. You don't have to worry about your family tree. You can just be. The clocks are ticking softly, somewhere far away. The snow is falling on St. Petersburg. The waves are lapping at the shores of Hawaii, and the moss is growing over the stones of Oak Haven. Everything is in its place. Everything is quiet. Close your eyes now. Let the stories blur together until they're just a low, rhythmic hum. You're drifting away from the 17th century, the 19th century, and the 20th. You're just here, in the present, which is the quietest place of all.